Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We're so happy to have you here at the Hood Museum of Art. My name is John Stomberg. I'm the Virginia Rice Kelsey 1961S Director of the Hood Museum, a position I'm super proud to have. And tonight we are here for the Dr. Alan W. Root Distinguished Lecture in Contemporary Art. Believe it or not, this is the 22nd annual Root Lecture. This lectureship was established by Dr. Root's children in honor of their father on his 70th birthday, and he's now 60. So something very special happened there, Alan. Yeah, we're not sure exactly what. Before I get into my introduction, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that Dartmouth and the Hood were built on unceded lands of the Abenaki people. And we have a printed statement that we read at all of our lectures. And what I've found is that over the last 10 years, I have started feeling that I'm not connecting with those words in the way I should. So I go off script now. And I like to just say that hopefully we make this acknowledgement so that all of you join us in reflecting on what it means to be on lands that were once held by civilizations for thousands of years. The Abenaki hunted here and lived and died here and loved and made homes. And it's an astounding history. And we at the Hood try and hold ourselves to a standard of care for these relationships on an ongoing basis. And I hope that you find that borne out in our galleries, that you see actual evidence of us caring about this, because it is important to us. And so even though we have that statement on our door, hopefully the work that we do speaks more eloquently about our passion and our need for continuing to acknowledge the great presence of Indigenous folks all across the country and around the world, actually. So with that, now that we've put ourselves in perspective about where we are, I start tonight's lecture. I would like to thank Dr. Root's children, Jennifer, Michael, and Jonathan, for choosing this gift for their father. It's so much better than a necktie. This is really an inspired gift, as it's brought brilliant artists and art historians, critics and curators to campus over the years, enriching the intellectual and cultural life of the Hood and the college. Dr. Root was a member of the class of 1955, and he went on to study medicine here as well. Happily, several of his children and grandchildren has followed his footsteps by attending Dartmouth College. It's a family affair. I also, each year, like to take a moment to remember Janet Root, Dr. Root's now deceased wife. Janet was a fierce advocate for the arts in her community. I wish I'd known her, because through her work in arts and education and her presence on the board of the Dolly Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, she was a well-known advocate for the power of art, especially with young folks, to get art to be part of their life early on and allow them to have a life that embraced creativity. So now it's time for me to get things started for real. At this time, I'm going to welcome to the podium Alisa Swindell, our curator for photography at the Hood and co-curator of the exhibition Visual Kinship, which is on view upstairs and which we're celebrating tonight. She worked on this show with Dr. Kimberly Juanita Brown, who is at Dartmouth, and Dr. Aiko Day from Mount Holyoke College, and Dr. Tai Fu from the University of Toronto. Thank you also to the director at Mount Holyoke, who's here somewhere, Tricia, for lending photographs to the show. We really appreciate it. And we're proud to have you as a Dartmouth alumna as well as the mighty director of the Mount Holyoke College Art Museum. And so with that, I turn it over to Alisa Swindell, who will get things started.
Hello and welcome. Tonight is, as John said, is presented in conjunction with Visual Kinship. Hope you all get a chance to go upstairs and view the show. It's really an excellent example, and I'm glad that you have these artists here whose work is on view in it. And so I'm going to give you their bios in order that they'll be speaking. First is Nancy Rivera. So her artistic practice explores the intersections of identity, memory, citizenship through the lens of her experience as a Mexican immigrant in the United States. She is a 2025 Visual Arts Fellow with the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and a recipient of the Center of Photographic Art Emerging Artist Grant. In 2024, she received Center's J. and Susie Tyrell Excellence in Works by Hand Award, and is a 2021 alumna of the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures Leadership Institute. Her work is held in public and private collections, including the Center for Creative Photography and the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, and proudly here as well. Kali Spitzer is a queer indigenous artist living on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in Vancouver, British Columbia. Her work embraces the stories of contemporary BIPOC and queer community members, creating representation that is self-determined. Kali's collaborative process is informed by the desire to rewrite the visual histories of indigenous bodies beyond a colonial lens. Kali's Cascadena from Delu, Lower Post, British Columbia, on her father's side, and Jewish from Transylvania, Romania, on her mother's. She is motivated by her heritage to uplift and preserve indigenous culture and knowledge ways through artwork and documentation of her community and traditional practices through photography. Chi Yin is an artist from Singapore whose research-based practice uses artistic and archival interventions to contest and complicate historiographies and colonial narratives. She works across photography, film, installation, performance, and bookmaking. She has exhibited at the 60th Venice Biennale, the Barbican, Harvard Art Museums, the Nobel Peace Museum, Arco Art Center in Seoul, and I cut several out for time. She has participated in the Guangzhou Image Triennial and twice in the Istanbul Biennale. Her work is in the collections of the Getty Museum, Brooklyn Museum, M+ Hong Kong, and the National Museum Singapore. She was an artist fellow in the Whitney's Independent Study Program and has a PhD in war studies from King's College London. She premiered her first theater performance, an hour-long monologue, in August 2024. After their talks about their work, I will join them on stage for a brief discussion and then an audience Q&A. Afterwards, we invite you to join us for a reception in the Russo Atrium, and please to view the exhibition if you haven't already seen it. And with that, I will cede the stage to Nancy.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight, and I just want to say thank you to the Hood for hosting me. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about two bodies of work that are deeply connected to my family's migration story. This is my family. This photo was taken in 1997, about 2 years before my parents and I immigrated to the US, while my brother stayed behind. Since that time, I always turn back to this photo as a family portrait, considering what it means and how, through immigration, our family structure changed over the last 25 years. When I considered what would I do to portray those 25 years of our time here as immigrants, I thought about different types of milestones, birthdays, graduations, weddings, and then I thought about this milestone, and it was the documents that shaped our experience, the documents that legitimized our legal status here in the US. So Family Portrait is the series of work that grew out of that idea. And it's a series of cross-stitched portraits that remake the passport-style photos from those documents that range from our US visas to our green cards to our American passports. Thinking about the images, for me, they always had a strange duality. I saw them as both impersonal, soulless, but also sacrosanct because of the weight that the documents that they are tied to have. But I also thought about that through the process of cross-stitching them by hand, I was bringing back that sanity and thinking about how I could, through the care of remaking them, how I could then bring back their soul, bring back our humanity. The material inspiration for the work came from my grandmother, who began her needlework when she was a child, and she still does so to this day at 94 years old. But because of the physical distance between us, she wasn't able to teach me how to embroider, and so I taught myself, and that was a journey. And for me, incorporating needlework into my practice is a way to reconnect with my family, with our history, and our traditions. In cross-stitching, there are several rules that you're meant to follow, and one of them is to have a very neat, orderly back. But the process was very intuitive for me at first, and I started leaving loose threads as I was making them, thinking that I would come back to it after I was done. But once I finished the first few portraits, I realized that they had sort of taken a life of their own, and I saw them as metaphors for the complicated bureaucratic process that each of these different documents that we had to go through to achieve them. And so this is my reinterpretation of our family portrait, and that traces those 25 years as our life as immigrants in the US. And you know, it's leaving behind a different kind of legacy, one that's shaped by US policies and immigration processes that oftentimes take away some of the humanity that immigrants really should be highlighted. And that was my way of memorializing that experience and my family's story. I briefly want to talk about a second body of work titled No Present to Remember. And it's a series of soft sculptures that combine snapshots that capture my childhood in Mexico with salt from Great Salt Lake and the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah, which has been my home for the last 25 years. In that process, they are both, they're straddling both past and present. And the process for them, I print the images on cotton, and this collection of portraits are some of the few keepsakes that I brought back with me when we moved from Mexico to the US. And after printing them on cotton, they are submerged in the salt water, and they slowly start to absorb that salt. The Salt Lake is very highly saline, so it has a huge content of salt, which is what helps me shape them, sculpt them into these abstract shapes that are both revealing and obscuring details from those moments that were captured. And it's similar to the way that I think about memories and the way that our family histories shift over time. So as I was rediscovering the images that make up both of these series, I really thought about wanting to hold space for more nuanced diasporic stories and the way in which we record and remember them. Thank you.
I don't actually usually have notes up here, but I'm a little nervous tonight. Hi, my name's Kali Spitzer. I'm grateful to be here on the traditional territory of the Abenaki and Wabanaki people. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me. As Alisa said, on my mother's side, I am a pro-Palestinian Jew, and on my father's side, I'm Cascadena. My culture and identity deeply informs the work that I make. And I also want to acknowledge my elders, community, land, and family for teaching me and affording me to make these photos and share them with you. The first series that I want to talk about is the North. These were all made in northern Canada, and they're images of my own family and my friends' family and neighboring nations. My practice is rooted in trust, connection, and collaboration. Connection to our lands, our people, our culture, each other. I wouldn't be able to make these images without trust. People are very generous in sharing these moments with me, and therefore I get to share them with you. And I was lucky to be able to travel to my friend Thema's family's fish camp in Tahltan country this last summer. I'm part of a generation whose parents were taken to residential school, stolen to residential school. And so making an archive for our future generations is really important to me, and being able to document our elders, our way of life, our language, is a pivotal piece of my practice. This is Thema's mom and her daughter setting a net. These images that are made are also an important part of the conversation of how climate change is affecting us as Indigenous people, and especially in northern communities. During this, I think we were there for 2 weeks, and the river had never been that high before, ever, and so we weren't able to fish some of the days. This is her grandmother fixing fish for canning and making dry fish. The next series of photos that I want to show you are from Gwich'in territory, which is a fly-in only community in Yukon, Canada. And they are of my friend Christine and her family tanning hides. These are moose hides and caribou hides. And hunting and fishing and tanning are integral parts of our way of life, culture, survival, how we pass down knowledge, how we make artwork. Christine's a really amazing artist, and I don't know, this is her daughter, Gugeju, playing in the yard. I'm not sure if any of you have tanned a hide before. It's not an easy process. It takes a lot of strength, determination, and so this is just snippets of the process. This is the part of the process where you're bringing out the hide, and a lot of the time what you're looking for is those bubbles. So this is also Christine. This is the softening part of the process, which can take days, weeks. You use different kinds of tools, and depending on where you are and whose community you're in, there's different ways to do this. And this is her daughter along the river. I don't know if there's any Indigenous folks in this room, but my favorite part of this picture is the deadly sticker on the four-wheeler. The next series I'll show you is exploration of resilience and resistance. And these images are about self-determination and representation and identity. Historically, photography has been a very complicated medium. It leaves a legacy of misrepresentation, violence, taking, appropriation, and the furthering of stereotypes of our peoples. In this series and most of my photography, I strive to heal that relationship of photography for our peoples with a focus on BIPOC and queer communities. The tintype process, which I learned from my mentor and friend, Will Wilson, really lends well to that because I like to work in a slow way. And I don't know if anybody knows about the wet plate collodion process, but you have to develop the images as soon as they're made. And so we get to go in the darkroom together and develop these images, and that really lends well to collaboration, especially if somebody wants to have something changed to their image, we can do that. And because the rest of my work is done on film, I don't get that opportunity to show folks what I'm making with them along the way. So for me, my practice is a lot more about relationship building and the moments that we have along the way instead of the final images that are made. My goal with these images is to witness my community and uplift our stories. For me, the most important part of photographing somebody is being able to reflect what I see in them and amplify their power, vulnerability, strength, humility. And for me, when we go in the darkroom together and we're able to see these images develop, which is a magical process, just being able to see their reactions, it's the heart of it for me. It's really why I do it. And a lot of people feel they look like their grandmother, or they just have their own beauty reflected back to them, which for me is definitely why I do it. And I just, do I have time? I don't know, am I fast, slow? Done? Okay. Anyways, you need a dark room right there while you're doing tintypes because you have to develop the images right on the spot. And I took my truck and loaded up a darkroom and all my chemicals and was able to go back to where I come from in Dalu a few years ago. And I photographed my own elders, which was a really important project for me. And this is Dennis Porter. So this is from these images. Also, it was a quite hilarious project too, to see their reactions. And you have to use a ton of light for tintype photography, so it can be a bit startling. But I wanted to end on an image of someone from my own community. So thank you so much for having me.
Hello. Thank you very much to the Hood for having me and commissioning me to make this installation that's upstairs that I hope you get to see. A birth. A death. Do time and history travel in a line or in circles? What comes around? For the past decade, I've been working on my family history and, by extension, that of the anti-colonial war in what was British Malaya, present-day Malaysia and Singapore. Just by a show of hands here, how many people have heard of the so-called Malayan emergency? Okay. So obviously it was a war that few have heard of or remember, but Malaya was in fact Britain's longest overseas war post-World War II, and one that in fact set precedents for other conflicts, like America's war in Vietnam. Malaya was where the British piloted the use of Agent Orange to destroy crops as food denial policy, as well as practices of ring-fencing the rural population to separate them from the insurgents, both later applied by the American military in Vietnam. The 12-year war between 1948 and 1960, in which the British quashed a communist-led insurgency in its colony of Malaya, has had an outsized importance in the history of warfare, its influences reverberating till today. Britain's counterinsurgency strategies, including defoliant use, as mentioned, forced relocations, mass arrests and deportations, and the zoning of so-called black and white areas have been written into Western military manuals and gone on to influence the campaigns in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and even Gaza, as some scholars have noted. The history of the Malayan War itself is written as a singularly successful crushing of a communist insurgency, a domino that did not fall as the Cold War engulfed Asia and the world. But depending on who you ask, it was also an anti-colonial resistance war, a precursor of independence. How do we actually remember these wars in which the camera was rarely in the hands of the losing side? From Malaya, the British conducted mass deportations of over 30,000, mostly ethnic Chinese, to their ancestral China for anti-colonial activities. These included my paternal grandfather, who had been an educator and newspaper editor. He was banished in mid-1948 to pre-communist China and executed weeks after he had arrived by the anti-communist Nationalist Army. His mother, wife, and 5 children left behind in Malaya never spoke about him ever again. Until I started digging up this history 60 years after the fact. My journey started from the family history and then through the traces of this forgotten war, through its sites of memory, places of ambush, the tin mining towns that were battlegrounds, the jungles where the non-human might remember, the jungles that also hold unmarked graves. This journey took me to the British Archives, the Imperial War Museum collection, to be specific, where I looked through the entire collection of photographs of this unremembered war. I cast what art historian Gabriel Moser calls a disobedient gaze on the archives and intervened with, reinterpreted the imagery, using light to create in-camera collages, merging verso and recto. Standing before the light box with my big pregnant belly, looking through all these images of war, destruction, and death, I started to wonder what transpired through my skin into my unborn child. I wondered what lineages carry across time and geographies. When my son was born into a world gripped by the first wave of COVID in 2020, I gave him a character from Granddad's Chinese name. I started to wonder what, beyond a name, what lines were drawn between these two characters. I became interested in the questions of transgenerational inheritances. I searched for methods to conjure onto the gaps of the colonial archive, to transcend the entrapment of the past and of the archive. I mapped the personal onto the geopolitical to seek ways to write more open-ended historiographies in the present. In the suitcase is a little bit rotten, which you see in the gallery upstairs, displayed as 10 glass plates on lightbox stands. I perform a double appropriation of colonial photographic apparatus. I remade magic lantern slides from the late 1800s and early 1900s by grafting characters and items as interventions into antique imagery. and then displayed them on replicas of glass negative retouching stands from the same era. We travel with Granddad and my toddler, who are teleported into a reimagined Southeast Asia, a chronotope of sorts. We go backwards in time, or is it forwards, or around? Using critical fabulation, can we remake the archive we inherit? Can we somehow transcend the violence and trauma within it? Can we remake it before passing it on to the next generation? Can we somehow find a more stereoscopic, prismatic view of history? In the new video piece, Time Travels with a Rotten Suitcase, which I'm debuting here, upstairs, I've reappropriated the form of the stereoscope, specifically the Viewmaster, used around the 1950s to the 1970s as a form of so-called travel from your armchair, and like magic lantern slides, were also a form of entertainment and children's cartoons. I've remixed images from Viewmaster reels, magic lantern slides, my own travel images, and colonial archival photography. I'm surfacing the little-known violent practices of Britain's war on Malaya, threading them through elements from photographic histories, to try to open up pathways to sensitize, remember, seek solidarities with the visual memory that we do have of other wars, like Vietnam, perhaps. Practices of beheading, dismembering, and post-mortem photography in Malaya, not yet in our collective knowledge or memory. If Nam immediately conjures multiple specific photographs in our mind's eye, we draw a blank with Malaya. Complicit as we are in the act of looking through the stereoscope, we travel through the Viewmaster reel, and the film upstairs asks that we make our own kinships in the act of viewing. Get to our seats.
Thank you all for such interesting looks into your practice and your work and the really different perspectives that you have. So I have a few questions so that maybe I can hear from you as a collective. All the questions won't apply to everyone, but I hope that everyone, feel free to speak. We have some time, and we do want to get to questions from the audience, but I would really like to hear from you very fully. So the relationship between the state and definitions of kinship and photography comes up in many and diverse ways in all of your projects, especially Chi Yin and Nancy, though, especially some of the things you said about going home, whatever, definitely comes up for you as well. So can you speak about that relationship?
Yeah, I was thinking about an element of the family portrait series that I didn't quite touch on during my talk. And in some of those images, especially when you see them individually and you read the title, they are kind of giving you clues as to the immigration process that we went through. And part of it is I was the first of my family to become a green card holder and then a citizen. And you see that through the dates included in those artworks. And to answer your question, at that moment, my family became a mixed status family, and that is something that created complications, both emotionally, but also through the idea that I could now call myself a legal, I have legal status, and what did that imply for my parents? What did that imply for myself? As you later see in the work titled American Daughter, that's kind of then me being separated from that family structure and creating a different type of dynamic with my parents. And I think something that visually I find really interesting is between the portrait of myself as a citizen and my parents as citizens that come from our passports, there's a 5-year gap, and my portrait is in color while theirs is now tinted blue. And that just kind of speaks to also the US immigration system that is constantly changing, constantly trying to get ahead of certain policies, and that in itself, I think, is telling a very specific story.
Anyone else want to?
Yeah, I mean,
You go ahead.
obviously the state uses photography as a form of indexing, as we've seen in Nancy's work quite clearly. And in the case of Malaya, obviously there were the pictures that were taken in prison before deportation. I mean, the British were pretty systematic about vaccinating everyone against smallpox and then photographing them and then putting them on the ships to ship them off to China. So one of the pictures that scrolled past in that presentation was the very last picture of my grandfather. And it turns out that it's his prison photograph. It's a prison mugshot with a clipboard with his name on it. And then, of course, I went into hunting for more of these, but among the things that turned up were images that were taken post-mortem. So there's another kind of indexing, even in death. And so the state's hand in using photography is obviously, present and potent. But by the same token, the things that are then now missing from the colonial archive is also somehow by the state's design. So, yeah.
Yeah, we had a brief conversation about which photos you couldn't find.
Yeah.
From what
and
was
sometimes what you
was
can't
missing.
find is frustrating, but then it gets kind of more interesting
Yes.
than what is actually there.
It becomes somewhat telling
Yep.
as well. Yeah. Did you want to? Okay. So all three of you are making lens-based work that looks really deeply at these family structures, but beyond the family, quote-unquote, family album. So how do these alternative ways of considering family, like how are they really playing out, did you say, in your work? And you all touched on it a bit in your conversations, but if you could just tell us a little bit more about that, sort of non-nuclear, but very deeply held, familial type relationships.
I think for me, considering family in both my queer communities and my Indigenous communities is quite expansive. Even how we refer to people as auntie. I have friends that aren't from this community and they're like, oh, so that's your dad's sister. I'm like, no. And so I think that family becomes really extensive, and the care that we give one another is also extensive. My friend Christine, who I was photographing tanning hides, I view her as family and as her children. I'm auntie to all of them. And I think that being able to make images that represent these connections is really important to me and does show that our kinship and connection to each other runs really deeply and through different nations as well. And I think that's an important thing to highlight too, especially is kind of that like solidarity throughout our nations and kinship because of also the tactics that our government has had in separating us and in colonization. And then for my queer kin, that's a different type of family to me, a chosen family. And I feel really grateful for that, and to be able to image our kinship throughout that and relationship to one another and care. And I think for a lot of queer and trans folks, that is a integral and main part of family. You know, not everybody is accepting, not everybody has accepting family and parents. And so that family bond with your queer kin becomes incredibly important. And being able to image those connections is a really beautiful moment for me.
You know, I was thinking about, in those series, I do portray my nuclear family, but it's, if I hadn't started with the family photo that I showed, you would never know that my two brothers are part of it. And it's been really hard for me to consider how or if it matters to include that part of the story. And in creating that work, this is an ongoing project, and as I've considered how to move forward with it, I have had friends of mine approach me who are immigrants and have gone through the same process, approach me to sort of say, you can use my images, they can be part of this larger story.
I think for me, the family photo album is a starting point. I think the family narrative is a sort of thread through which to look at this bigger story of this one war in the Cold War in Asia, but also a lot of the other decolonization wars that took place like it, and whose stories we haven't fully reckoned with, I suppose. So the family album is an entry point, and I have taken things from the family albums and grafted them onto these larger histories, and so it sort of is, the story's as small and as big as you want to make it.
I was really fascinated the first time that we met in person, and you told me about receiving that photo of your grandfather, that prison photo, and then it was in the reel that she showed with the hand holding the photo, and that moment of that, you know, them reaching out with that, and how that became a moment of knowing a family history that had been, you know, shielded from you or not discussed.
For 6 decades.
Yes, for 6 decades. And that it could be reawoken and spoken of again through that photo being shared seemed just so special as a point where so much of this work also seems to stem from. Mm-hmm. You know, and then I listened to Kaylee talking about, you know, the family members, the children who were stolen to the schools, and what that means to whose photos aren't there because they weren't present for those moments, and think about, you know, how that works, and your absent brothers who don't continue. So I think all of that is a really interesting thing to think about, both the photos that are present, the photos that are absent, and then the wonderful way that they have all led that through their work. So I did also want to ask you, and this is a more general about being part of this, which I love, that how being part of a group show, being in this type of exhibition, how that affects your perception of your work. When you see it next to other work, when you meet other artists who are being put in conversation with you, how that might affect it, appeal to you. You only want solo shows and never want to see anyone again.
I think it's wonderful, and I think it's a way to see the work in a new light. And even being in conversation with 2 fantastic artists, you get to talk about that experience, and seeing the work together just creates a whole different narrative that I would have otherwise not been able to see.
Well, I feel like it's also an opportunity to learn more about yourself and your practice, hearing other wonderful artists talk and how that they relate to their work. I don't ever want to only be in solo shows. I love being in group shows. This is, for me, being able to connect. And, you know, I could consider both of you kin. That's really the heart of it for me, is being able to connect. And I think as far as viewing my work in a different way, I just feel that I've learned a lot from both of you. And that just, in itself, would inherently make you view your work in a different way, you know? Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yeah, it's always nice to have that cross-fertilization and association, and it is seeing your work in a different narrative. And I always enjoy having just, you know, other people look at the work and make sense of it, because I know what my intentions are, but the interpretation is something else. And to see it in relation with other works that speak to similar themes but have a different approach is always very interesting.
I partly came to that question after we went up to see the show together, and hearing you all as you viewed each other's works, and you had such wonderful things to say to each other. It was so appreciative, and then standing back and going, oh, I see how I can now see this angle and still see your work as well. You know, as curators, we really try and put a lot of intention into sightlines and relationships of the work, but to have this wonderful moment to get to hear the artists themselves talk about that and how that was part of how they viewed the show and saw the show and then saw their work within the show was a really beautiful moment with all of you. Is there anything that you would like to share or that has come up having seen the show or conversations or listening to each other talk that you would like to speak to before we open it to the audience? You don't have to, just.
I kind of want to know what happened with your brothers.
Well, my brothers, so there's a big age difference between us. My older brother's 10 years older than me, and our middle brother, he's 6 years older than me. At the time we left, they were in college, they were adults, and they decided that they wanted to stay in Mexico. And then we're now split in different continents and countries, so that complicates things even more. Thanks for asking.
Okay, so I guess now we can open it if anyone has any questions in the audience.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to see the show. I really appreciate your talks and how much you were able to communicate to us in such short presentations, and how well they work together. I have a lot of questions, but one of the things I was struck by when I heard all of you speak was the intimacy of your practice and the extent to which you're engaging with, you know, people that you care about, and the fact that you're also photographers, right, who are looking to communicate and talk to bigger audiences, people who are not connected to your families or you. And I just would love to hear you talk about that. Like, how do you work with those lines, that, you know, that relationship you have to your subjects, that history of photography that can be so objectifying and exploitative, and then your role as public artists who are putting it out in the world and trying to create an environment of care so that when people engage with these people you love and care about, there's a respect for the stories.
I think ultimately, obviously you can't control how somebody interprets something, but I feel very protective of the work that I make and the people that I work with. And one of the ways that I try to show that is the language that I use. When I speak about people I work with, I actually don't use the word subject. And I try to say, can we make a photo, not take a photo? I check in with people where the photos go, because for me, the most important part of my work and making the work is for the people in the photographs. And so that even boils down to if somebody doesn't want their image out in the world anymore, I'll retire it. I can't backdate things that are already out there, and that's previously discussed. But I think that for my work and how I try to be ethical and honor people and respect self-determination, those are some of the ways in which I do that, and keeping in conversation with people, and also knowing when to photograph moments and when not to. Or if somebody's feeling emotional while you're photographing them, to check in and say, do you want this moment on film? Or do you just need space to be held for you? And yeah, and then people are usually quite generous in letting me share it with all of you.
Sure. While I was making this work, I'm a very private artist when it comes to my practice. It's only when I have studio visits that I kind of let someone in. But as I was making the work, I was being very secretive about it. I didn't know if it was going to turn out. Making cross-stitched portraits is something that you have to actually create fully to see if it's going to become something. And there's always a very scary moment as I'm approaching the end of it when I'm like, this is not gonna work. And then I always leave the eyes to the very last moment, mainly because it's very difficult and you have to be very precise. But something happens when the eyes are finished and they come alive. And so I hadn't told my parents that I was creating these works, and I felt sort of an ownership over that story. But before showing them for the first time, I did realize that that story includes them, and I'm showing work that's very personal. So I remember telling them what it was. I didn't show them, I just told them the concept and the content of those portraits. And when they saw it in person, they were kind of amazed. And we didn't really talk about it, but they just understood. We just knew, what I was trying to say with that story. And as I've continued the work, I do check in with them, and they always know if I'm asking for a document what I'm up to. So, so we're in conversation, but in a way that they just kind of know I'm being very thoughtful and careful with the way that I use these images.
Troy. Just briefly, I suppose, in my case, I suppose, for 60 years, the family didn't want to talk about this history. And so it took a lot of tenacity to get them to open up. And then eventually, actually, my oldest uncle became my biggest collaborator. He wrote a 50-page family history on a Word document with pictures in English and gave it to me by email, sent it to me by email, and I was like, whoa, okay. So that 50-page Word document has been the basis of a lot of my further research. The other members of the family, it's been a mixed kind of bag of whether, different people had different levels of willingness to speak about this. And of course, now 15 years into the project, I've gone on to make a theater performance about the family history. And at the premiere in Singapore in August last year, the first row, 19 seats, were members of the family, aged from, I guess, 19 to 95 or something. So that was quite scary. But I think they've kind of accepted that there is a purpose in telling this story. It's not just our family's story. It's a history that has been silenced and needs to be surfaced, and not just within the post-colonial states of Singapore and Malaysia, but in many, many places where there are these types of stories in the closet. They need to be somehow surfaced. And I just happen to be the nosy third-generation ex-journalist that has done this.
Hi, I have a question that any of you could answer or none at all. I'm quite interested in the selection of the medium of photography, and would be curious to know if any of you had attempted to do any of your projects in another medium, and what does photography give you versus something else? Like when you're were you searching for the topic through the medium, or was a selection after you came up with the topic or the idea?
I'll start. That's a really interesting question because while I was trained as a photographer, I hardly ever use a camera to create my work. And oftentimes it's questioned as whether it is photography or not. And I have very strong feelings about that. My work is always rooted in photography. And while these images, I create them so that they do hold a photorealistic look to them, the process isn't, I'm not making necessarily a photo in the traditional way, but the process to get to the final product is definitely based around photography and what I took away from my having been trained as a photographer. And so it's always very interesting to have those conversations about what photography is or can be. And for me, I always think, I love cameras, and there's something that, I approach in a very different way, but to me, photography was always something that was the base, the root of a project. It wasn't the end product. And so I'm always constantly thinking about how else can I push forward the medium?
So yeah, my work begins with photography as well, I suppose. But my training is actually in history. So I use textual documents, I use visual documents, archives, and all of it is, somehow harnessed to make work from. And the work is not necessarily photography either. I've made books, I've written performance lectures, I've scripted this theater performance now, and I think it's just different mediums have different ways of communicating and storytelling. What a visual art exhibition can do is not the same as what a 1 hour theater performance can do. So it's just sort of using, what makes the most sense to tell that piece of the story. But photography, I suppose, straddles that accessibility, to people, as well as, gives you the ability to make an aesthetic object as well. So I guess it's that medium that allows you to do both of those things, and maybe that's why many of us use it.
I'm a lot more traditional than these two in my practice. So I do use the medium photography, and I haven't mixed that with anything else. I have other hobbies, though.
She drives a truck.
Yes.
She has other skills.
Thank you for sharing your work with us. I really enjoyed it, and as a photographer, photography is close to my heart, so it was wonderful. But I'm curious, are these ongoing projects, or are you all, do you have other things like on the back burner that you're looking forward to starting? Because I know for myself, I can never finish anything. It's always ongoing. I was just curious.
Mine are definitely ongoing. I am definitely excited to add to the collection of projects. I think for me, there's changes in how I'm able to approach things. For example, a lot of my earlier work was completely self-funded, whereas now I'm able to apply for grants and share resources, monetary resources, with my friends and family because of a certain point that I've hit in my career. So a lot of the images that you saw that were from the Northern series from last year is from a grant that I applied for so that I could pay my friends a hefty wage to be on the land, doing what they were already doing, making an archive to give back to them with no need for me to be able to use it in my own practice. I have permission to share them, and if people want to exhibit them. So there's changes like that, but the series are still ongoing. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
My work is also still ongoing. The family portrait series began as a concept in 2020. And it's because I learned how to cross stitch on my own. It's been, a long ride to understand the medium. And as I was talking about earlier, the process of creating the patterns for the portraits, it can be very intricate. It can take, many, many hours. And so I'm still learning how to achieve what I envision. And it takes a long time to create them. So that's still very much ongoing. But because I every time I finish a portrait, it takes so much out of me, both like physically and mentally, that I have to take a break for a few months before making another one. So in between, I'm starting other projects and doing research as well.
Mine are definitely ongoing and seemingly never ending. It's going into 16th year already. Definitely lots more research threads that I haven't made into pieces of work that need to be made into something. And I'm working towards another sort of performance-activated installation for a solo in New York next year that is related to this work, and it's probably the next chapter or an addendum to. Yeah, so there's still a lot of work to be done.
I was wondering, I guess I kind of have two questions. The first is like, do you have, you mentioned like in some ways you're just drawing inspiration from like the medium itself. I was wondering if you had any other inspirations when it came to other artists that you thought had kind of like helped you along on your journey. And also like, I know when I do like a project, often like the end result's very different from what the beginning result is. Do you feel like it kind of evolved over time, or do you feel like you just kind of achieved what you had initially set out to achieve, or it just sort of took shape in, I don't know, that sort of way?
I'm just trying to make a mental list of everyone that's inspired me. Shelley Nero has definitely been a big inspiration for me. My mentor, Will Wilson, Cara Romero, and Francesca Woodman and Sally Mann were inspirations to me when I was younger. I think that, of course, our opinions and the way that we interpret things grow with us and change. There's so many, I'm very inspired by the people that I photograph as well. And most of the people that I photograph are artists in their own right. And it would take forever to list everybody. But everybody in the photos is an inspiration for me, and obviously my elders and where I come from. What was the second part?
That was kind of just like, I guess I was wondering if the project ended up taking shape like you expected it would. I know it's still ongoing, but I was wondering if there were like any unexpected twists.
Oh yeah. Chemicals are really finicky to work with. Cameras break when you're in a fly-in-only community. So there's definitely unexpected things, but I think that often makes room for you to change focus and maybe something else comes out of it.
Yeah, it's what you saw, the last slide I showed with all the portraits, that's what I consider to be like, the final or not the final project, but at least from that phase. And there's at least twice as many that exist in my studio because I've had to rework a few of them over again just to see, what difference a slight change might make. And it does make all the difference. So sometimes that's just kind of part of the practice. And sometimes I think back on like what my production was that year, and it feels very slow, but at the same time, going from one portrait to another, it takes such a long time that it's, you just kind of have to accept the pace at which you can go when you decide to employ a very like slow, methodical type of process into your work.
I think up to 2 weeks ago, we had none of us had any idea what that video on the second floor was going to be like. So yeah, no, definitely we start with an idea, and you know, you try different things, and then you're into edit 5, and you're like, what is this work? You know, and then you go back to the drawing board and you start again. No, definitely it's a process of evolving, you know, from that one gem of maybe not gem, one idea that you begin with, and then you end up with something that references that idea, or it could be quite far away from what you thought you were going to make. It's just different each time.
Yeah, definitely the conversation we had about the installation last summer and what is in the room this summer
It's totally
are
different.
two,
It's quite
they're
different,
two different
yes.
things. They still involve the magic lanterns, and yeah.
Yeah, so definitely evolved.
Okay, thank you all. Please, let's let them get to their photographs, but you guys all go have some refreshment and mingle, and then we will join you, and you'll have a chance to talk to them. And thank you all very much for coming this evening.